Have you ever seen a millionaire businessman get humiliated? Well, this actually happened at a luxury hotel, and the ending is unbelievable. It might sound like something out of a movie, but this story is real, and it shows how appearances can be deceiving. At 53, Richard had amassed a fortune that made headlines, but his life had become an exercise in elegant emptiness. The soft hum of his smart home system announced the start of another meticulously scheduled day. Richard adjusted his bespoke Tom Ford suit, a ritual as familiar as breathing, while his personal assistant's voice echoed through the intercom, rattling off the day's appointments with mechanical precision. Each meeting represented another million, another acquisition, another victory in a game he had mastered long ago but couldn't stop playing. "Mr. Graham," his assistant's voice wavered slightly, "your sister called again about your mother's birthday celebration next week." Richard's jaw tightened. "Tell her I'm in Singapore," he replied, the lies sliding off his tongue with practiced ease. The truth was more complicated. His mother's disappointed eyes, his sister's persistent attempts at reconciliation, the weight of decades of chosen absence. All of it felt like a distraction from the empire he had built. The morning passed in a blur of video conferences and hostile takeovers. Richard sat at the head of his conference table, watching his executives squirm under his cold gaze. They presented quarterly reports with trembling hands, knowing his reputation for firing people on the spot for the smallest miscalculation. He had earned the nickname, the architect of aftermath, for his ruthless ability to dismantle companies and rebuild them in his image, never mind the human cost. "The Jenkins merger is hesitating," his CFO reported, sweat beading on his forehead. "They're concerned about employee retention." Richard's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Retention? They'll be lucky if we retain half their workforce. Schedule the board meeting for tomorrow. I'll handle it personally." He watched satisfaction ripple across his executive team's faces, not because they agreed, but because they had learned that agreement was survival. As the day wore on, Richard felt an unfamiliar restlessness creeping into his bones. The view from his office, once a daily reminder of his success, seemed to mock him with its vastness. He found himself staring at the empty chair across from his desk, remembering the last time his father sat there, years ago, before their final argument. "You're building a fortress, son," his father had said, "but what good is a fortress if you're the only one living in it?" Richard had dismissed those words then, but they had a way of echoing in the quiet moments, becoming louder with each passing year. He pushed the memory aside and focused on his upcoming weekend plans, a stay at the Augustine, the most exclusive hotel in the country. It was a reward to himself for closing the Martinez deal, though he couldn't remember the last time he had truly enjoyed any of his rewards. His phone buzzed with messages from various board members, each one trying to curry favor or warn him about potential corporate threats. Richard ignored them all, instead pulling up the hotel's website. The Augustine boasted private butlers, helicopter pads, and rooms that cost more per night than most people made in a year. It was exactly the kind of place that understood the proper way to treat someone of his stature. As his driver navigated through Manhattan's evening traffic, Richard noticed a young couple on the sidewalk, sharing earbuds and laughing at some private joke. For a moment, something like envy flashed through him, not for their obvious lack of wealth, but for the easy intimacy they shared. He pushed the feeling down, reminding himself that he had chosen this path, that emotional attachments were luxuries he couldn't afford in his rise to the top. The car passed a series of restaurants where people gathered for dinner, their conversations and laughter spilling onto the street. Richard tapped on the privacy screen, blocking out the scene. He had no patience for such displays of ordinary life. His world was above all that. In boardrooms and penthouses, where the air was thin but the profits were astronomical. His phone rang again. This time it was his mother, her name appearing on the screen like an accusation. Richard watched it ring until the screen went dark, adding another missed call to the hundreds that had accumulated over the years. He told himself it was better this way. He had nothing to offer them except money, and they had made it clear long ago that money wasn't what they wanted from him. As the car approached his building, Richard reviewed his itinerary for the weekend. He had instructed his assistant to ensure the Augustine understood exactly who he was and what he expected. The list of demands was extensive. specific room temperatures, particular brands of mineral water, precise thread counts for the sheets. Power, he had learned, was in the details, in making others bend to your will in even the smallest matters. The doorman rushed to open his car door, bowing slightly as Richard emerged. "Good evening, Mr. Graham." Richard walked past without acknowledgement, his mind already on tomorrow's departure. Behind him, he heard the doorman mutter something under his breath, but he didn't care. Let them talk. Let them resent him. As long as they feared him enough to do their jobs perfectly, their opinions meant nothing. In his penthouse, Richard poured himself a glass of 50-year-old scotch and stood before the windows, watching the city lights flicker like stars brought down to earth. Tomorrow, he would remind another exclusive establishment exactly who Richard Graham was. He raised his glass to his reflection in the window, trying to ignore the hollow-eyed man who stared back at him. The night stretched before him, empty and pristine as always. In the distance, a siren wailed, and for a moment, Richard envied its purpose: to rush toward something, to matter in a crisis, to be needed. He pushed the thought away and focused on his plans for the Augustine. They would learn, as everyone did, that Richard Graham's money demanded perfection, and anything less was unacceptable. As he prepared for bed in his vast, empty apartment, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. But he had spent too many years building walls to acknowledge the obvious, that perhaps the thing missing wasn't something money could buy, but something he had walled himself away from long ago. Tomorrow would be different, he told himself. Tomorrow he would surround himself with the kind of luxury that made everything else fade away. But as he lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, Richard Graham, the billionaire who could buy anything, couldn't purchase the one thing he needed most: a peaceful night's sleep. Sleep evaded Richard like a mischievous spirit, dancing at the edges of his consciousness before slipping away entirely. The Egyptian cotton sheets, imported at an extravagant cost, felt suddenly abrasive against his skin. He watched the digital clock on his nightstand count the minutes with merciless precision. 2:17 a.m., 2:18 a.m., 2:19 a.m. Each minute a reminder of his isolation in this tower of wealth he'd built around himself. When dawn finally broke, it found Richard already in his home gym, punishing his body on a treadmill that cost more than some cars. Sweat dripped down his temples as he pushed himself harder, trying to outrun the whispers of doubt that had crept in during the sleepless night. The physical exertion was familiar, controllable, unlike the uncomfortable thoughts that had begun to surface. His morning routine proceeded with military precision. The private chef presented a breakfast of perfectly poached eggs and artisanal sourdough, but Richard barely tasted it as he scrolled through overnight market reports from Asia. His phone buzzed incessantly: emails, messages, meeting requests, each one a reminder of the empire that demanded his constant attention. "Sir," his personal assistant materialized at his elbow, tablet in hand. "The car is ready for your departure to the Augustine. I've confirmed all your specifications with the hotel management." Richard nodded curtly, already mentally rehearsing his entrance. The Augustine wasn't just any five-star hotel. It was a fortress of luxury that catered to royalty, tech billionaires, and Hollywood elite. Its reputation for discretion and extravagance was legendary, matched only by its astronomical prices, which, to Richard, merely meant it needed to be perfect. The drive to the hotel was a study in mounting anticipation. His driver navigated through Manhattan's morning traffic, while Richard reviewed the dossier his team had prepared on the Augustine's key staff. He believed in knowing everything about everyone who might serve him: their backgrounds, their weaknesses, their pressure points. Knowledge was power, and power was everything. The Augustine rose before them like a modern palace, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun in a display of architectural brilliance. Richard observed the doormen's practiced movements as they welcomed other guests, noting with satisfaction the subtle ways they distinguished between the merely wealthy and the truly powerful. He straightened his Brioni suit jacket, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They were about to learn where he fell on that spectrum. His car pulled up to the entrance, and Richard waited. 3 calculated seconds, no more, before allowing the doorman to open his door. The moment his Italian leather shoes touched the red carpet, he began his assessment. The doorman's bow was precise but not obsequious. The bellhop's approach was prompt but not hurried. The marble lobby gleamed with old-world opulence, yet Richard's trained eye caught a barely perceptible scuff on one of the pillars. "Welcome to the Augustine, Mr. Graham," the front desk manager approached with a practiced smile. "I'm Thomas Morton. We're delighted to have you with us." Richard didn't return the smile. "The presidential suite was prepared according to my specifications?" "Of course, sir. Every detail has been attended to exactly as requested." But Richard detected a slight hesitation in Morton's voice, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. Something wasn't right, and Richard Graham hadn't become a billionaire by ignoring such subtle tells. "Show me," he commanded, cutting off Morton's practiced welcome speech. The manager's smile flickered for just a moment, another red flag that set Richard's instincts humming. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, thick with unspoken tension. Richard watched Morton's reflection in the polished elevator doors, noting how the manager's fingers twitched slightly at his sides. By the time they reached the presidential suite, Richard was certain he would find something amiss, and part of him almost hoped he would. There was a certain pleasure in catching people in their failures, in reminding them that perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. The suite doors opened to reveal a space larger than many homes, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city. Richard moved through the rooms like a general inspecting his troops, noting every detail, every potential flaw. The temperature was exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit, as specified. The specific brands of toiletries were arranged with geometric precision in the marble bathroom. The bar was stocked with the exact vintages he had requested. But then he saw it, the flower arrangement on the dining room table. He had specifically requested white orchids, and while these were indeed orchids, they had the faintest hint of pink at their centers. To most people, it would have been a trivial detail, perhaps even an aesthetic improvement. To Richard, it was an unforgivable deviation from his explicit instructions. "Mr. Morton," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "perhaps you could explain why my simple request for white orchids has been interpreted so creatively." Morton's face paled slightly. "Mr. Graham, let me check the original order specifications." "Don't bother," Richard cut him off. "The fact that you need to check tells me everything I need to know about the standards at the Augustine. I had heard this was the finest hotel in the country. Clearly, I was misinformed." The manager's professional composure cracked just slightly. "Sir, I assure you we maintain the highest standards. If the flowers aren't to your liking, we can have them replaced immediately." "Replace them?" Richard's laugh was cold. "Tell me, Mr. Morton, how does replacing them now erase the fact that your team failed to execute a simple instruction? Should I assume this is indicative of how all my requirements will be handled during my stay?" By now, several other staff members had gathered at the suite's entrance. Drawn by the commotion, Richard could feel their eyes on him, could sense their growing discomfort. Good. Let them witness what happened when excellence was promised but mediocrity was delivered. "Mr. Graham," a new voice entered the conversation. A young woman in the hotel's uniform stepped forward, her name tag identifying her as Sarah Chun, assistant manager. "I take full responsibility for the flower arrangement. There was a supply issue with our usual florist this morning, and rather than delay the suite preparation, I made the decision to use these orchids. I should have consulted you first. I apologize." Richard turned his cold gaze on her, expecting to find the same servile fear he was accustomed to seeing in employees' eyes. Instead, he found something unexpected: dignity. She met his gaze steadily, her apology genuine but not groveling. For a moment, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. Richard felt a strange sensation, one he couldn't immediately identify. It took him several seconds to realize it was respect. Not the forced respect his money usually commanded, but something he hadn't earned and couldn't buy. The realization irritated him even more than the flowers. "Well, Ms. Chen, your honesty is noted, but it doesn't change the fact that the Augustine has failed its first test. I'll be requiring a complete audit of every specification I provided, and I expect personal confirmation that each one has been met exactly as requested. Not approximately, not creatively interpreted, exactly." The staff scattered to comply with his demands. leaving Richard alone in the vast suite. He stood at the windows, looking out over the city he had helped shape through his business dealings, yet somehow feeling less in control than he had moments ago. The exchange with the assistant manager had left him unsettled in a way he couldn't quite define. He pulled out his phone, intending to distract himself with work, but instead found himself staring at the missed call notification from his mother. The pink-tinged orchids caught his eye again, and unbidden, a memory surfaced. His mother's garden, where she had lovingly tended to orchids of every color, teaching a young Richard about the delicate balance needed to help them thrive. "Sometimes, Richard," she had said, "the most beautiful things in life are the ones we didn't plan for." He pushed the memory away, angry at himself for this moment of weakness. He was Richard Graham, the man who had built an empire by demanding perfection, by never accepting excuses, by treating every deviation from his instructions as a personal affront. He wouldn't let a few flowers and a surprisingly dignified hotel employee shake his conviction in the rightness of his approach. Yet as the day wore on and the hotel staff scurried to address his every demand, Richard found himself increasingly aware of the hollow victory in watching them scramble. Each nervous interaction, each hurried correction, each deferential bow, all of it felt somehow less satisfying than it should have. As the afternoon light cast long shadows across the presidential suite, Richard found himself pacing the expansive space like a caged lion. Each step on the imported marble floors echoed his growing disquiet. The staff had corrected every minor imperfection he'd pointed out. The white orchids now stood pristine and perfectly colorless on the dining table. The temperature had been adjusted by precisely half a degree, and even the angle of the magazines on the coffee table had been meticulously arranged to his specifications. Yet satisfaction eluded him. Instead of the usual pleasure he derived from witnessing others scramble to meet his demands, he felt a nagging emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing hour. The suite, despite its flawless execution of luxury, felt suffocating. He loosened his tie, an unconscious gesture that would have shocked his business associates, who had never seen him with anything less than perfect composure. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from his executive team, announcing the successful completion of another hostile takeover. 5 years ago, this would have been cause for celebration. Now, he barely registered the victory. Instead, his mind kept returning to Sarah Chen's steady gaze, the quiet dignity in her apology, and the unsettling feeling that perhaps he had been the one who failed some essential test of character. Richard walked to the bar and poured himself a glass of 30-year-old scotch, the same brand he kept in every office and home he owned. The familiar burn of the liquor did nothing to quiet the uncomfortable thoughts swirling in his mind. He found himself thinking about the Jenkins merger his team was working on, specifically about the employee retention concerns his CFO had mentioned. How many families would be affected by his decisions? How many Sarah Chens would face unemployment because he deemed their positions redundant? The sound of housekeeping staff quietly working in the hallway caught his attention. He could hear their hushed conversations, their careful movements, all designed to be invisible to the hotel's demanding guests. Had he ever really noticed the people who maintained his various properties? Did he know any of their names, their stories? His reflection in the window caught him off guard. The setting sun painted harsh shadows across his features, and for a moment, he saw himself as others might see him. A man surrounded by luxury but devoid of warmth, demanding perfection from others while blind to his own fundamental flaws. The image was so startling that he actually stepped back from the window. A knock at the door interrupted his unsettling reverie. "Come in," he called out, expecting another staff member with yet another adjustment to his specifications. Instead, it was Sarah Chen again, holding a leather portfolio. "Mr. Graham, I have the detailed audit you requested of all implementation measures for your stay." She placed the portfolio on the nearest table, her movements efficient but unhurried. "You'll find everything documented, including the corrective actions taken for any deviations from your original specifications." Richard studied her for a moment. Unlike the other staff members, who had grown increasingly nervous around him throughout the day, she maintained a quiet professionalism that seemed impervious to his attempts at intimidation. "Tell me, Ms. Chun, how long have you worked in the hospitality industry?" The question seemed to surprise her, but she answered without hesitation. 15 years, Mr. Graham. I started as a housekeeper while putting myself through college. Something in her response struck a chord. Richard remembered his first job, working in his uncle's hardware store during high school. He had hated every minute of it. The early mornings, the demanding customers, the endless inventory counts. But it had taught him something about work, about dignity, about the value of earning your way. When had he forgotten those lessons? And now you're assistant manager at the Augustine, he mused, more to himself than to her. That's quite a journey. Every position in this hotel matters, Mr. Graham, she replied, a subtle emphasis on her words that wasn't lost on him. From our housekeepers to our executive chef, we all contribute to creating an experience for our guests, even when that experience isn't quite perfect. The last words carried a hint of gentle reproach that both surprised and intrigued him. Richard found himself wanting to defend his earlier behavior, to explain why maintaining exacting standards was crucial in his world. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he realized how hollow those justifications would sound. Instead, he asked, the original orchids, the ones with pink centers, where did they come from? Sarah's expression softened slightly. They're from a local florist who's been supplying our hotel for 20 years. A family business. The owner's daughter is taking over now, experimenting with hybrid varieties. Those orchids were some of her first successful breeds. The information hit Richard like a physical blow. He thought about his own father, about the family business he could have inherited, but instead had rejected in favor of building his empire. He thought about all the small, family-owned businesses he had crushed or absorbed over the years, seeing them as nothing more than assets to be acquired or eliminated. Ms. Chun, he said, his voice unusually quiet, would it be possible to bring those orchids back? She studied him for a moment, perhaps trying to determine if this was some sort of test. Of course, Mr. Graham, they're still in our florist's shop. Please do. And he hesitated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. I apologize for my earlier behavior. It was unwarranted. The surprise that flickered across her face made him realize just how rare such words must be from someone like him. She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. I'll have them brought up right away. After she left, Richard sank into one of the suite's plush chairs, feeling suddenly exhausted. The leather portfolio with its detailed audit lay unopened on the table, a testament to the kind of perfection he had always demanded but now found himself questioning. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from his sister. Mom's birthday dinner next week. She misses you. We all do. For the first time in years, he didn't immediately dismiss the message. Instead, he found himself remembering Sunday dinners from his childhood, when success was measured not in dollar signs, but in the warmth of family gatherings, in his mother's proud smile, in his father's firm but loving guidance. When had he decided that power was more important than connection? When had he started believing that respect could only be earned through fear? The sun had almost set now, painting the city in shades of purple and gold. In the distance, he could see families in neighboring buildings gathering for dinner, their silhouettes moving behind lit windows like scenes from a life he had forgotten was possible. The thought of his own empty penthouse waiting for his return suddenly seemed less like a symbol of success and more like a self-imposed prison. Sarah returned with the pink-centered orchids, placing them carefully on a side table. In the fading light, their gentle color gradients created an effect that was subtle yet striking, a natural imperfection that somehow made them more beautiful than their pure white counterparts. They're quite remarkable, he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. Sometimes the most beautiful things aren't the ones that follow our exact specifications, Sarah replied, echoing his mother's words from so many years ago with uncanny similarity. Richard felt something shift inside him, like a key turning in a long rusted lock. The carefully constructed walls of his isolated existence didn't come crashing down. Change rarely happens so dramatically, but a small crack appeared, letting in a whisper of something he had forgotten existed. The possibility of connection, of seeing the world not as a series of transactions to be won, but as a web of relationships to be nurtured. As night fell over the city, Richard Graham, the billionaire who had spent decades building an empire of material perfection, sat in his flawless hotel suite, contemplating the imperfect beauty of pink-tinged orchids and wondering if perhaps it wasn't too late to learn a different way of measuring success. In the months that followed his stay at the Augustine, Richard Graham's transformation became the quiet talk of Manhattan's elite circles. The architect of aftermath gradually became known by a different moniker, the bridge builder. The change wasn't instantaneous or absolute. Old habits die hard, especially those cultivated over decades, but it was undeniable. The Jenkins merger went through, but not as originally planned. Instead of dismantling the company, Richard worked with the existing management to preserve jobs while improving efficiency. His board members were initially skeptical, but when the restructured company showed impressive growth within the first quarter, they couldn't argue with the results. He began attending his mother's Sunday dinners, at first awkwardly, then with increasing comfort. The first time he walked into her garden, he noticed she still grew orchids, dozens of varieties, including some with pink centers remarkably similar to those from the Augustine. They spent an afternoon there, his mother teaching him about crossbreeding techniques while gently crossbreeding their relationship back to life. The Augustine became his regular retreat, not for its luxury, but for the reminders it offered. Sarah Chen became an unexpected friend and advisor. He helped fund her initiative to create a hospitality training program for underprivileged youth, while she helped him remember the human side of business he had long forgotten. His penthouse underwent subtle changes. The sterile perfection gave way to touches of life. Family photos, mismatched books, and yes, orchids of various colors. The staff noticed that their formerly intimidating boss now knew their names, asked about their families, and actually listened to their ideas. 1 year after his transformative stay, Richard stood at the podium of his company's annual meeting. The room was packed with executives, employees, and media, all curious about the changed man before them. Success, he began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, isn't measured by the walls we build around ourselves, but by the bridges we create to others. I spent years perfecting the art of isolation, mistaking control for power and fear for respect. He paused, looking out at the faces before him, faces that now showed genuine attention rather than barely concealed fear. Today, we're announcing the Graham Foundation for Community Development. Its first project will be a series of small business incubators designed to support family-owned enterprises across the country. Because sometimes the greatest innovations come not from disruption, but from nurturing what already exists. Later that evening, as he walked through his mother's garden under the setting sun, Richard's phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo from Sarah. The original pink-centered orchids from the Augustine had produced offspring, creating a new variety that the florist had named Graham's Dawn. He smiled at the irony. His legacy would now include not just buildings and acquisitions, but a flower celebrated for its beautiful imperfection. Richard Graham had built his empire on the pursuit of perfection, only to discover that life's most precious moments often came from embracing its flaws. His transformation wasn't perfect. He still had moments of his old self, still struggled with the instinct to control rather than connect. But he had learned that true power lay not in demanding perfection from others, but in accepting the imperfect humanity in himself. Epilogue. The story of Richard Graham's transformation spread beyond Manhattan's business circles, becoming a quiet legend in its own right. Not because he became a saint, he didn't, but because he became something far more valuable, human. His company continued to thrive, not despite but because of its new approach to business. The Graham Foundation grew to support hundreds of small businesses, creating a network of success stories that proved profit and compassion could coexist. The orchid variety named after him became known not just for its unique coloring but for its resilience, much like the man himself. And in his mother's garden, where it all began and began again, Richard learned to find peace in the simple act of nurturing growth, both in flowers and in relationships. In the end, Richard Graham discovered that true transformation isn't about becoming someone else entirely, but about remembering who you were meant to be all along. His life became a testament to the idea that it's never too late to change, that even the hardest heart can learn to beat with compassion, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is admit they were wrong and try again. The billionaire who once measured success in dollars and cents learned to measure it in smiles, in thank you notes, in family dinners, and in the quiet satisfaction of helping others grow. And while his bank account remained impressive, it was no longer the metric by which he judged his worth. Instead, he found his value in the connections he built, the lives he touched, and the legacy of kindness he would leave behind. A legacy far richer than any fortune he had ever amassed.